On the morning of December 31st, 2008, hundreds of thousands of Zune 30 GB media players across America simultaneously froze. Users waking up in college dorm rooms and suburban homes found their screens permanently locked on a glowing logo. It was the leap year bug, a simple, overlooked coding error in the device's clock driver that effectively bricked every first-generation model on the last day of the year. For Microsoft, it was a hyper-visible, physical collapse of a $500 million crusade. The company had poured a fortune into dethroning Apple, which held a suffocating 70% of the digital music market. Yet, despite immense capital, Microsoft would quietly execute the Zune hardware line entirely by the fall of 2011. The paradox of the Zune was that it was not a poorly engineered machine. It featured bold hardware and a digital subscription model that accurately predicted the future of music. But the real story of the Zune is not just how a tech giant built a rival to the iPod. It is the story of how a software empire discovered that owning the American desktop meant absolutely nothing once the future moved into the palm of a hand. Every week, we tell the stories of American devices, platforms, software, stores, and screens that once taught the country what the future felt like and what happened when the market moved on. Subscribe if that history matters to you. The story begins not with nostalgia, but with a specific place in Redmond, Washington, in the early months of 2006. In the early months of 2006, deep inside the Microsoft campus in Redmond, Washington, executives were quietly studying a crisis that was unfolding not in corporate server rooms, but on the family desks of millions of American homes. Microsoft's operating system, the core software that manages a computer and lets other programs run, held an absolute monopoly on the personal computer. Windows XP was the default environment for American digital life. But a Trojan horse had breached the gates, and it was disguised as a music player. 3 years earlier, Apple had released iTunes for Windows. By 2006, the white interface of iTunes had become the daily digital hub for an entire generation. It bypassed Microsoft's own Windows Media Player entirely. For Microsoft, this was an existential threat. If American teenagers, college students, and office workers learned to trust Apple for their music, they would eventually trust Apple for their phones, their software, and their next computer. Microsoft realized that controlling the operating system was no longer enough if another company controlled the user's primary daily habit. At the time, Microsoft relied on a network of hardware partners, companies like Creative, Samsung, and Dell, to build MP3 players that ran on a Microsoft software standard called Plays for Sure, but the American retail shelf was brutal. These fragmented, clunky devices were being slaughtered at Best Buy and Circuit City by the seamless hardware-software integration of the iPod. To survive, Microsoft decided it had to abandon its partners and build its own closed ecosystem, a network of hardware, software, users, and services that would mirror Apple's strategy. Under a shroud of secrecy, a team led by Xbox visionary Jay Allard launched Project Argo. The mandate was clear: build a premium, Microsoft-branded media player that could break Apple's cultural stranglehold. Because they needed to move with extreme speed to catch the 2006 holiday shopping season, Microsoft did not build the hardware entirely from scratch. They partnered with Toshiba, taking the underlying architecture of Toshiba's Gigabit portable player and heavily customizing the exterior, the interface, and the software. The goal was not just to match the iPod, but to fundamentally rethink how digital music should be shared in an era before ubiquitous smartphones. Before Project Argo, sharing music meant physically handing someone a white earbud on a school bus, or burning a mixed CD-ROM, a shiny plastic disc used to distribute files and media. There was no wireless way to beam a song to a friend sitting across a dorm room. Microsoft saw this isolation as Apple's vulnerability. On November 14, 2006, the result of Project Argo officially landed on American retail shelves. It was called the Zune. Backed by a staggering $500 million marketing campaign, the first-generation Zune featured a 30-gigabyte hard drive, a storage device that keeps files and operating systems even after power is off, and launched at a precise price of $249.99. It arrived at mall electronics stores and big-box retailers in three colors: black, white, and a highly controversial, distinctly earthy brown. The brown plastic was not an accident. It was a deliberate, calculated rebellion against the sterile, glossy white aesthetic of the iPod era. The brown Zune featured a subtle, translucent double-shot plastic shell that gave it a deep, glowing edge in the light. It was designed to feel organic, like a vintage guitar amplifier or a piece of classic audio equipment. Microsoft's advertising campaign branded "Welcome to the Social" plastered American cities, college campuses, and subway stations. It framed the iPod as an isolating, antisocial device that locked users in their own bubbles. The Zune, by contrast, was marketed as the center of a vibrant, interconnected community. For an American high school student stepping into a circuit city in late 2006, the Zune presented a fascinating alternative. It felt substantial in the hand. It had a larger, 3-inch color screen that made album art and video look vastly superior to the cramped display of the iPod Classic. It featured a built-in FM radio, a feature Apple stubbornly refused to include. Early reviews from the American tech press were mixed, but intrigued. Critics praised the large screen and the ambitious wireless sharing concepts, but they questioned the bulky dimensions and the strange color palette. More importantly, Microsoft was demanding that users abandon their carefully curated iTunes libraries. Switching to Zune meant migrating thousands of MP3 files, navigating new desktop software, and leaving behind the familiar white earbuds that had become a status symbol in American high schools. The Zune was attempting to build a new network effect. Network effects, the pattern where a product becomes more valuable as more people use it, meant that the Zune required other Zune owners to be in the same physical space for its social features to matter. If a teenager bought a Zune, but all their friends had iPods, the device was an island. Despite the immense financial muscle pushing it into the market, the Zune faced an agonizing reality on day one. It was a very good device, widely attempting to disrupt a market that had already chosen a winner. Microsoft had the hardware in stores, but it had yet to realize that Apple was no longer merely selling electronics. It was selling a cultural default. Despite the immense cultural wall built by Apple, the engineers in Redmond did not simply copy the iPod. The Zune was designed with a fundamentally different philosophy about how digital media should behave, look, and travel through physical space. To understand the breakthrough of the Zune, one must look at the device as a physical object sitting on a dorm room desk in late 2006. Apple's iPod was famous for its polished metal back and stark white face, a design that was beautiful but notoriously fragile, prone to scratching the moment it touched a table. Microsoft chose a different industrial path. The Zune featured a unique manufacturing process known as double-shot plastic molding. The outer shell consisted of a solid core color encased in a thick, translucent layer of polycarbonate. This gave the device a sense of depth, durability, and a glowing edge that caught the light in college computer labs and mall food courts. It did not feel like a delicate piece of jewelry. It felt like a heavy, durable piece of audio equipment. The interface was built around a distinctive navigation button quickly dubbed the Squircle, a square with rounded edges. While the iPod used a capacitive touch wheel to scroll through endless lists, the Zune relied on a tactile, clicking directional pad. Above that pad was a bright, 3-inch liquid crystal display. At a time when Americans were just beginning to download digital video, the Zune's screen was significantly larger and more vibrant than the cramped display of the iPod Classic. But the true breakthrough of the Zune was not visible on the plastic shell. It was embedded in the silicon. The original Zune included a built-in wireless radio. In 2006, Wi-Fi, a wireless networking technology that allows devices to exchange data without cables, was common in laptop computers, but almost unheard of in dedicated MP3 players. Microsoft used this hardware to introduce a feature that was supposed to change how American teenagers shared music. They called it, somewhat awkwardly, squirting. The concept was brilliant in theory. If two Zune owners were sitting next to each other on a high school bus or across from each other in a university library, one could wirelessly beam a song directly to the other's device. There were no cables. There was no need to plug into a computer. It was a digital evolution of handing a friend a cassette tape. However, this breakthrough collided immediately with a brutal market reality. Microsoft was not a pirate organization. They were a massive corporation heavily dependent on legal partnerships with the four major record labels that controlled the global music industry. The record labels, still traumatized by the piracy era of Napster, were terrified of a device that could wirelessly distribute perfect digital copies of songs in physical spaces. To appease the labels, Microsoft wrapped the sharing feature in digital rights management, or DRM, hidden software code that dictates exactly how, when, and where a digital file can be played. The DRM rules imposed on the Zune were agonizingly strict. When a user beamed a song to a friend, the receiver did not own the file. The song was locked by a rule known as 3 days or 3 plays. The recipient could listen to the track a maximum of 3 times, and after exactly 72 hours, the file would digitally evaporate from their hard drive. It did not matter if the sender had legally purchased the song, or even if the song was an unprotected, ripped file from an old CD. The Zune software treated almost every transferred track with the same draconian lockdown. This artificial friction broke the network effect. A technology feature designed to feel like magic ended up feeling like a strict rental agreement. Yet hidden behind these frustrating DRM rules was the Zune's most prophetic breakthrough, the Zune Pass. In the mid-2000s, the American digital music market was built entirely on an ownership model. Apple's iTunes store had trained the country to pay exactly 99 cents to permanently download a single digital track. Users meticulously curated massive local libraries on their desktop computer hard drives. Microsoft introduced a radically different financial system. The Zune Pass was a subscription model, a system where users paid a recurring fee of $14.99 a month, rather than buying permanent copies of individual songs. For that monthly fee, a Zune owner could download an unlimited amount of music from the Zune marketplace directly to their device. They could fill their entire 30-gigabyte hard drive with thousands of albums without paying another cent. It was a localized precursor to cloud streaming. It was exactly the business model that Spotify and Apple Music would use to conquer the world a decade later. But in 2006 and 2007, American consumers were highly suspicious of renting their music. If a user stopped paying the $14.99 monthly fee, the DRM servers would send a signal to the device, and every downloaded song would instantly go dead. Americans were not yet comfortable with the idea that their personal music library could be turned off by a corporate server. The Zune was attempting to force the future before the infrastructure and culture were ready. The hardware was sturdy. The wireless concept was ambitious. The unlimited subscription model was economically visionary. The underlying ecosystem was revolutionary, and Microsoft was about to prove that if they couldn't immediately break Apple's culture, they could attempt to outdesign it entirely. By late 2007, the initial shock of the bulky brown first-generation Zune had settled. Instead of retreating from the brutal American retail market, the engineers in Redmond doubled down. They realized that to win shelf space, they needed a complete ecosystem, not just a single 30-gigabyte brick. In November 2007, Microsoft released the second generation of Zune hardware, completely overhauling the product line. They introduced the Zune 4 and Zune 8, smaller devices that utilized flash memory, a type of fast storage with no moving parts, making the players incredibly thin and immune to skipping when a user went for a run. For heavy listeners with massive music libraries, they launched the Zune 80, which relied on a traditional hard drive but featured a dramatically slimmer profile. The controversial brown plastic was gone, replaced by a sleek, matte black, red, pink, and green finish. The original mechanical squircle button was replaced by the Zune Pad. This was a stroke of hardware brilliance. A four-way directional pad that was also touch-sensitive. An American college student navigating their library could physically click the button to move track by track, or lightly swipe their thumb across the surface to fly through hundreds of artists in seconds. It seamlessly bridged the gap between tactile control and the emerging era of touch interfaces. But the most stunning transformation happened on the American desktop. In 2007, managing a portable media player required a host computer. Apple's iTunes looked like a digital spreadsheet, rows and columns of text, sterile and functional. Microsoft completely rebuilt the Zune desktop software from the ground up to look like an interactive music magazine. When a user plugged their device into their family computer, the Zune software did not just list files. It pulled high-resolution photography of the artist from the internet, splashing it across the entire monitor. It utilized bold, oversized typography for artist names and albums. It was immersive. It made managing a digital music collection feel like browsing through physical vinyl records in a local indie music shop. In addition to the software redesign, Microsoft introduced the Zune Social, an online community built directly into the platform. Users created digital profiles, known as Zune tags, which automatically tracked and broadcasted every song they listened to. It was a social network, an online platform built around profiles, connections, and shared identity, designed specifically for music discovery. If a user in a Chicago dorm room discovered a new indie rock band, their friends across the country could immediately see it on their Zune desktop client, click the track, and download it instantly using their $14.99 Zune Pass subscription. It was an ecosystem working exactly as intended. To support this new aesthetic, Microsoft launched the Zune Arts campaign. Instead of relying on traditional corporate commercials, they handed millions of dollars to independent animators, underground graphic designers, and indie bands. The advertisements were surreal, colorful, and highly artistic short films. This marketing pivot created something Microsoft had rarely achieved in the consumer hardware space: genuine countercultural appeal. In an American high school, where the white Apple earbuds had become the inescapable default, pulling a Zune out of your pocket became a deliberate statement. It signaled that you cared about audio quality, that you preferred a subscription model over buying individual tracks, and that you actively rejected the mainstream monopoly. A fiercely loyal subculture formed around the device. Digital communities like Zune boards became gathering places for enthusiasts who traded tips, custom background images, and software updates. They proudly called themselves the Zune Army. In mall electronics stores across the country, the retail reality began to shift. The Zune displays at Best Buy and Circuit City expanded significantly. While they never approached the massive 70% market share of the iPod, Microsoft firmly secured the number 2 spot. The Zune was selling millions of units. The Zune Pass subscription was quietly building a dedicated user base of heavy music listeners who realized that renting an infinite library was far superior to owning a limited one. For a brief window between 2007 and 2008, Microsoft had successfully built a parallel digital universe. They had the hardware, they had the software, and they had a fervent community. But the engineers in Redmond were not finished. They were preparing to release one final piece of hardware, a device intended to be the absolute pinnacle of dedicated portable media, just as the ground beneath the entire industry began to fracture. In September 2009, Microsoft unleashed what many hardware historians still consider one of the most beautiful pieces of consumer electronics ever built, the Zune HD. If the first generation was a bulky experiment and the second generation was a refinement, the Zune HD was an aggressive, undeniable flex of Microsoft's engineering power. The colored plastic was gone. The device was now encased in a cold, premium brushed aluminum shell held together by exposed screws on the back, giving it an industrial, architectural weight. The front of the device was entirely dominated by a 3.3-inch OLED touchscreen, a display technology where each individual pixel emits its own light, allowing for perfect, ink-like blacks and impossibly vibrant colors. Inside that aluminum shell sat an NVIDIA Tegra processor, an advanced mobile chip powerful enough to render complex three-dimensional graphics and output 720p high-definition video directly to a living room television through a specialized dock. It also featured a built-in HD radio receiver, hardware that pulled in high-fidelity, static-free local broadcasts without requiring a cellular data connection. But the true masterpiece of the Zune HD was not just the glass and metal. It was the software. With the Zune HD, Microsoft introduced an entirely new design language called Metro. At a time when Apple's iPhone and iPod Touch were organizing the American digital experience into neat static grids of square app icons, Metro looked like a kinetic digital magazine. It was completely typography-led. Instead of tapping a small, isolated picture of an album, the user swiped across massive, bold text that literally bled off the edges of the screen, inviting the thumb to pull the next menu into view. As an American teenager scrolled through their library, high-resolution artist photography slowly panned in the background. The interface was fluid, fast, and aggressively different. Microsoft also introduced Smart DJ, an algorithm that analyzed a user's local library and instantly generated an endless radio station of similar artists by pulling tracks seamlessly from the cloud. It did not treat music like a spreadsheet of files. It treated it like an immersive experience. In an American dorm room where a glowing laptop sat on a cramped desk, the right pocket device did not merely play audio. It decided how a student discovered culture, how they navigated their digital identity, how they blocked out the physical noise of the campus, and who felt that the future had finally arrived. For a heavy music listener in 2009, holding a Zune HD connected to a $14.99 Zune Pass subscription was a revelation. It felt like holding a limitless, perfectly organized record store in the palm of a hand. A user could hear a song on the campus radio, search for it on the Zune HD over a local Wi-Fi network, download the entire album instantly, and have it waiting on their desktop computer when they returned to their room. The retail perception shifted dramatically. In mall electronics stores across the country, the Zune HD demanded attention. When shoppers picked up the demo units at Best Buy, the tactile response of the aluminum and the blinding contrast of the OLED screen sold the device immediately. Tech reviewers who had previously mocked the brown plastic of 2006 were forced to admit that Microsoft had not just matched Apple. They had, in several key areas, built a superior media player. The Zune marketplace on the desktop was humming with activity. The Zune army of enthusiasts was highly engaged, creating custom graphics and actively evangelizing the subscription model to anyone who would listen. Microsoft had successfully built a premium closed-loop ecosystem that finally felt like it belonged in the future. At its highest point, the Zune HD was a masterpiece of digital design. Yet beneath the brushed aluminum, the ground under portable media players was already beginning to fracture. The first crack in the Zune empire was not a flaw in the brushed aluminum of the Zune HD, nor was it a rebellion by the fiercely loyal Zune army. The first crack was a quiet realization about the physical limits of American pockets. By late 2007, Microsoft was fully engaged in a brutal retail war against the iPod. But the market force that would ultimately destroy the Zune was Force 4, smartphone displacement and convenience. A dedicated media player, no matter how beautifully designed or heavily subsidized, required a user to carry two distinct pieces of hardware. In June 2007, Apple released the iPhone. At first, it seemed like a parallel market, an expensive luxury item for business professionals and early adopters. But the device was explicitly marketed as three tools in one: a phone, an internet communicator, and a widescreen iPod. For the American consumer, convenience did not need to be perfect. It only needed to be available and already in the pocket. The Zune ecosystem offered a superior, immersive music interface, but the smartphone was rapidly eliminating the need for a standalone music box entirely. The fatal blow to the dedicated MP3 player arrived a year later, in July 2008, with the launch of the App Store, a controlled marketplace where users could find and install software applications directly to their device over the air. Microsoft had built Wi-Fi into the Zune to allow teenagers to squirt songs to each other under strict, expiring digital rights management rules. Apple used Wi-Fi to let users download games, instant messengers, and entirely new functionalities while sitting on a living room couch. The Zune was locked into being a beautiful music player. The smartphone was an open portal to the entire internet. When Microsoft realized that the definition of a pocket device was fundamentally changing, they scrambled to adapt. They attempted to introduce software applications for the Zune HD, hoping to turn it into a broader computing platform. But they immediately slammed into Force 3: network effects, ecosystems, and developer support. A platform, a technology system that other products, developers, and services build around, requires a critical mass of users to attract independent programmers. Because the Zune still held a single-digit market share compared to the iPod and the rising iPhone, developers simply ignored it. Why spend months writing a game for the Zune HD when the iOS App Store offered immediate access to tens of millions of credit cards? Microsoft managed to secure a handful of basic apps and independent games, but there was no massive developer ecosystem. The loop was broken. Without apps, users migrated to smartphones. Without users, developers refused to write apps. Furthermore, despite its wireless sharing capabilities, the Zune ecosystem remained heavily tethered to the personal computer. To activate a device, update the operating system, or manage a massive Zune Pass subscription library, an American user still had to physically plug the player into a desktop or laptop via a USB cable. The Zune desktop software, while visually stunning and critically acclaimed, was a massive, resource-heavy program. In a college dorm room, booting up a sluggish Windows PC just to sync a new playlist was beginning to feel like an outdated ritual. The tech industry was already shifting toward cloud services, systems that store or process data on remote servers instead of only on a local device. Then came the physical rupture. Just as Microsoft was preparing to push its software ecosystem into the future, a ghost in the machine shattered consumer trust in the hardware. On the morning of December 31, 2008, owners of the original brown, black, and white 30-gigabyte Zunes woke up to find their devices entirely unresponsive. It was not a localized glitch, nor was it a targeted cyber attack. Across the country, hundreds of thousands of Zune players simultaneously froze on the glowing startup screen. It became known as the leap year bug. The processor, the main chip that performs calculations inside the device, relied on a clock driver written by a third-party contractor. The underlying code failed to properly account for the extra day at the end of a leap year, When the internal clock struck the final day of 2008, the software entered an infinite loop, locking up the entire system. While the devices miraculously fixed themselves 24 hours later, on January 1st, the psychological damage to the brand was permanent. In the American tech market, hardware reliability is the absolute foundation of consumer trust. The mainstream press relentlessly mocked the failure. Retail workers at mall electronics stores had to deal with lines of confused, frustrated customers demanding refunds for bricked devices on New Year's Eve. On the retail shelf, the physical space dedicated to the Zune began to rapidly shrink. Circuit City, one of Microsoft's major early retail partners, was plunging toward bankruptcy, eventually liquidating its massive big-box stores entirely. At surviving chains like Best Buy and Target, the MP3 player aisle itself was being compressed. Floor space was being reallocated to carrier stores, smartphone displays, and accessories. A teenager walking into a mall no longer gravitated toward the dedicated media player case. They walked straight to the mobile carrier kiosk. The device in the user's hand still played music, but the world had moved its attention to a glass screen that could download entirely new realities from the air. By the end of 2010, the writing was on the wall for the entire category of dedicated portable media players. Force 4, smartphone, cloud, streaming, and convenience displacement was reshaping American habits at a blinding speed. An American consumer no longer needed to manually sync a massive library of MP3 files to a pocket device via a USB cable. Cellular networks were getting faster. Emerging services were proving that streaming, delivering audio directly over the internet without requiring the user to own a permanent physical copy, was the actual future of mobile audio. Why carry a dedicated aluminum media player when an Apple iPhone 4 or a Motorola Droid could stream infinite internet radio stations from the cloud while simultaneously providing turn-by-turn navigation and text messaging? Inside the Redmond campus, a painful corporate calculation was taking place. The Zune HD was critically acclaimed, but it was fighting a war that the smartphone had already ended. The immense engineering resources required to maintain hardware supply chains, negotiate directly with record labels, and fight for shrinking physical retail space were no longer financially justified. Instead of building a successor to the Zune HD, Microsoft executed a strategic pivot. They took the greatest asset of the Zune ecosystem, the striking, typography-heavy Metro design language, and cannibalized it. Microsoft moved the core Zune design team over to their mobile division to build Windows Phone 7, an entirely new smartphone operating system designed to fight the iPhone and Google's rising Android platform. The Zune software became merely a built-in media feature inside the new phone. The dedicated music player was effectively placed on life support. Out in the American retail landscape, the physical disappearance was swift and merciless. At big-box electronics retailers like Best Buy and Target, the expansive Zune demo kiosks were quietly disassembled. The floor space was immediately handed over to massive walls of smartphone cases, prepaid carrier phones, and tablet computers. The remaining stock of brown, black, and brushed aluminum Zune devices was pushed to the clearance bins, heavily discounted in a desperate attempt to clear the inventory before the holidays. Then came the formal execution. Microsoft did not hold a press conference. There was no grand retrospective for a project that had consumed hundreds of millions of dollars in research and marketing. On October 3, 2011, the company simply updated a standard customer support webpage. The text was blunt and final. Microsoft would no longer produce Zune player hardware. They would continue to honor existing warranties, but the physical era of the Zune was officially over. For the fiercely loyal Zune army, who had proudly defended the device on digital forums, it was a bitter confirmation of a reality they had been dreading for a year. But the hardware was only half of the ecosystem. The Zune Pass, the revolutionary $14.99 monthly subscription service that allowed users to download unlimited music, survived the death of the plastic and aluminum devices. However, in the brutally fast-paced American tech market, a failed hardware brand quickly becomes a toxic asset. In 2012, as Microsoft attempted to unify its vast entertainment divisions, they stripped the Zune name from the software entirely. The subscription service was rebranded as Xbox Music and later Groove Music. The vibrant Zune PC desktop software, once praised as an immersive digital magazine that made managing files feel like browsing an indie record store, was eventually abandoned. It was replaced by sterile utilitarian applications built for Windows 8 and Windows 10. The community features, the Zune social tags, and the unique artistic identity that Microsoft had paid indie animators millions to create were systematically erased from the internet. The final agonizing consequence of the Zune ecosystem collapse hit the users who had trusted Microsoft's digital architecture the most. To appease the major record labels back in 2006, Microsoft had wrapped restrictive digital rights management, or DRM, hidden software code that dictates exactly how, when, and where a digital file can be played, around the Zune ecosystem. This older DRM required a constant connection to a corporate server to verify a user's ownership license. Years later, when Microsoft finally decommissioned the legacy DRM authentication servers to save on infrastructure costs, the trap of the early digital era snapped shut. A college student who had spent hundreds of dollars building a carefully curated digital library in 2007 discovered that their investment was instantly worthless. American users who had legally purchased individual tracks covered in older DRM suddenly found their files completely unplayable. It did not matter that they had paid for the music. Without the corporate server to verify the license, the local files became dead data on their family desktop hard drives. The music they thought they owned was gone. The retail shelves emptied, the aluminum players powered down, the software was rebranded. The subscription model was copied. The authentication servers went dark. The digital locks broke. The files became unplayable. The community scattered. The ecosystem collapsed. The physical brand did not survive the corporate consolidation of Microsoft's entertainment divisions. The Zune name, once backed by a $500 million marketing campaign across American cities, was quietly retired, replaced by shifting corporate priorities, cloud-based rebrands, and the relentless march of mobile computing. Yet the legacy of the Zune did not simply vanish into an e-waste bin or a landfill on the outskirts of an American industrial town. Instead, it survived in unexpected corners of digital culture, preserved by a community that refused to let the hardware fade into total obscurity. Today, a dedicated enthusiast network keeps the platform alive through digital archaeology. On online forums, vintage hardware preservation boards, and specialized collector communities across the United States, enthusiasts hunt for rare 120 gigabyte models and pristine Zune HD units. Preservationists trade technical guides on how to solder replacement batteries into sealed aluminum shells, how to swap fragile mechanical micro drives for modern solid-state flash memory, and how to keep legacy desktop sync software running on modern versions of Windows. This preservation culture is not driven by simple sentimental longing. It is a physical argument about a specific era of engineering. The Zune matters today because it was a prophetic failure. The core subscription model pioneered by the Zune Pass, paying a recurring monthly fee for unlimited access to a massive cloud catalog rather than owning individual digital files, became the undisputed foundational business model for the modern music and entertainment industries. Spotify, Apple Music, and Xbox Game Pass all walked down the economic path that Microsoft mapped out a decade too early, at a time when record labels and consumers were still fiercely attached to the concept of permanent ownership. Furthermore, the typography-led Metro design language developed for the Zune HD did not die with the hardware division. It migrated directly into the software that powered millions of American phones and enterprise computers, shaping the flat, minimalist design aesthetic of Windows Phone, Windows 8, and modern user interface development across the entire tech sector. In American popular culture, the device even achieved an ironic afterlife. Years after the hardware lines were formally canceled, a brushed aluminum Zune HD appeared as a central plot device. In Hollywood blockbusters like Guardians of the Galaxy Vol. 3, thrusting the obscure Microsoft player back into the global spotlight and introducing an entirely new generation of viewers to the forgotten brick of Redmond. The story of the Zune is a stark reminder of a harsh market truth in American technology. Innovation, bold industrial design, and a visionary subscription model are never enough on their own. A technology empire cannot win by building a better device if the cultural default, the developer ecosystem, and the retail distribution channels belong entirely to someone else. America did not stop wanting portable music. It stopped wanting it in a device that required a USB cable, a desktop computer, and a dedicated pocket. Somewhere in an American desk drawer, a brown 30-gigabyte Zune still sits with a worn, double-shot plastic shell and a dead battery. The screen dark, the tactile squircle button silent, waiting for a network that no longer answers. See you in the next video.